When archaeologist Dr. Sarah Mitchell received an anonymous package containing a 400-year-old Portuguese journal, she never expected it would lead her to a tribe that history had completely erased from existence. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had spent 15 years studying pre-Columbian civilizations throughout South America, but nothing in her academic career had prepared her for the mystery that arrived at her university office on a rainy Tuesday morning in Boston. The package bore no return address, only her name written in careful script across weathered brown paper. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a leather-bound journal so old that its pages crackled at the slightest touch. The Portuguese text on the first page was dated 1587, written by someone named Padre Francisco de Almeida. The journal's early entries described typical missionary work among indigenous populations along the Rio Solimões, but as Sarah carefully translated the fading ink, the tone shifted dramatically. Day 127. We have found them at last, read one entry. The people Capitan Rodriguez spoke of in hushed whispers. They call themselves the Arawete Carib, but they are unlike any indigenous group we have encountered. Their knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and agriculture surpasses even our European understanding. Yet there is something about this place that fills my soul with unease. What followed were detailed descriptions of a highly advanced civilization, hidden deep within the Amazon rainforest. Padre Almeida wrote of terraced gardens that climbed impossible cliff faces, of water management systems that controlled entire river valleys, and of astronomical observatories carved into living rock. But most intriguingly, he described a people who seemed to possess knowledge that shouldn't have existed in the 16th century. Detailed maps of distant continents, mathematical calculations that predicted celestial events centuries in advance, and medical procedures that saved lives European medicine couldn't touch. Sarah cross-referenced the journal's geographical descriptions with modern satellite imagery and felt her pulse quicken. The landmarks Padre Almeida described, a distinctive horseshoe bend in the river, twin waterfalls cascading from a mesa-like formation, and a series of ancient stone monuments, matched a remote region of the Brazilian Amazon that had never been thoroughly explored by modern archaeologists. But when she searched academic databases for any mention of the Arawete Carib people, she found nothing. It was as if an entire civilization had been deliberately erased from historical records. The final translated entry sent chills down Sarah's spine. Day 203. I fear I have made a terrible mistake. The gifts they have shared, the knowledge they have trusted us with, we were not worthy guardians. The others speak of gold and glory, but I see only tragedy ahead. If God wills it, may this journal survive to warn future generations. Some knowledge is meant to remain hidden, for the world is not ready for such wisdom. Below this entry, in different handwriting and fresh ink, someone had written a modern GPS coordinate and a single word in English. Find. 6 months later, Sarah found herself stepping off a seaplane onto the murky waters of a remote tributary, deep in the Brazilian Amazon. The humidity hit her like a wall as she gathered her research equipment, her mind still reeling from the bureaucratic nightmare it had taken to secure the necessary permits for this expedition. Her team consisted of 3 people she trusted completely: Dr. Carlos Mendoza, a linguist specializing in extinct Amazonian languages; Rebecca Chen, a forensic anthropologist with extensive field experience; and their local guide, Tomás Ribeiro, whose family had lived along these rivers for generations. Tomás had been reluctant to take the job when Sarah first contacted him. That area you want to visit, Doutora, he had said over a crackling satellite phone connection. My grandfather used to tell stories about that place, strange stories. He said it was cursed, that people who went there sometimes came back different, or didn't come back at all. But Sarah's persistence and the substantial fee she offered had eventually convinced him. Now, as he loaded their supplies into a sturdy wooden boat, his weathered face carried an expression of deep concern. The journey upriver took 3 days of careful navigation through increasingly narrow waterways. The forest grew denser and more primordial with each mile they traveled. Ancient trees towered overhead, their canopy so thick that sunlight reached, the water in scattered golden beams that danced across the surface like spotlights. The sounds of the jungle created a constant symphony around them. The calls of howler monkeys echoing in the distance, the splash of caimans sliding into the water, and the haunting cries of birds that seemed to watch their progress with unusual intelligence. On the second night, as they made camp on a small beach beside the river, Tomas shared more of his grandfather's stories around their campfire. He said there was a place where the trees grew in perfect circles, where you could find ruins that didn't match anything the archaeologists had ever seen. But he also said that people who disturbed those ruins brought misfortune to their families for generations. Carlos laughed nervously and made a joke about academic superstitions. But Sarah noticed that even Rebecca, usually skeptical of local folklore, listened with rapt attention. By the third day, they had reached the coordinates. From the journal, the landscape matched Padre Almeida's descriptions perfectly. The horseshoe bend in the river, the twin waterfalls visible in the distance, and most remarkably, the stone monuments he had written about. These weren't natural rock formations, but clearly carved megaliths, weathered by centuries, but still bearing traces of intricate geometric patterns. They were unlike anything in the established archaeological record of the region, suggesting a level of social organization and artistic sophistication that challenged everything Sarah thought she knew about pre-Columbian Amazonian cultures. As they set up their base camp near the monuments, Sarah felt a strange sensation, as if the forest itself was watching them. The usual sounds of jungle life seemed muted here, replaced by an almost expectant silence that made her skin crawl. But her scientific curiosity overrode her unease. Tomorrow, they would begin exploring the ruins that Padre Almeida had described, and perhaps finally uncover the truth about the mysterious Arahuete Carib people who had vanished from history. The first light of dawn revealed wonders that took Sarah's breath away. Beyond the stone monuments, hidden by the forest's careful camouflage, lay the remnants of what could only be described as a lost city. Terraced gardens, exactly as Padre Almeida had described, climbed the cliff faces in perfect geometric patterns, their ancient irrigation channels still functional after centuries of abandonment. Massive stone platforms supported the ghostly outlines of what had once been substantial structures, their foundations revealing a sophisticated understanding of engineering that rivaled anything the Incas had achieved. Rebecca immediately began documenting the site with her camera and measurement tools, her excitement barely contained. "Sarah, look at these construction techniques," she called out, examining a wall where massive stones fit together without mortar, their joints so precise that even after 400 years, not even a knife blade could slip between them. This isn't just advanced for pre-Columbian Amazonia. This rivals the best megalithic construction anywhere in the ancient world. The implications were staggering. Standard archaeological theory held that such sophisticated stonework hadn't existed in the Amazon basin before European contact. Carlos had discovered something equally remarkable near what appeared to be the city's central plaza. Carved into a massive boulder were symbols that made his hands shake with excitement as he traced their outlines. "These aren't from any known Amazonian writing system," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But they're not random either. There's definitely a pattern here, a syntax. This is a written language, Sarah. A completely unknown written language from a civilization that supposedly never developed writing." He began making detailed rubbings of the inscriptions, working with the careful precision of someone who understood. They might be documenting one of archaeology's greatest discoveries, but it was Tomas who made the discovery that changed everything. While the scientists worked on their documentation, he had been exploring the edges of the site, following what appeared to be an ancient pathway that wound deeper into the forest. When he returned to camp that afternoon, his face was pale, and his usually steady hands trembled as he poured himself coffee from their camp stove. "Doutora," he said to Sarah, "there's something you need to see, but I don't think we should disturb it." The path Tomas had found led to a circular clearing where the trees did indeed grow in perfect geometric patterns, just as his grandfather's stories had described. In the center of this natural amphitheater stood a structure unlike anything Sarah had ever encountered in her career. It was a pyramid, but not built of stone blocks like those in Mexico or Guatemala. Instead, It appeared to have been carved from a single massive boulder, its surface covered in the same mysterious script Carlos had found on the plaza stone, but far more extensive and complex. At the pyramid's base, arranged in precise circles, were dozens of smaller carved stones that appeared to be markers or monuments. But what made Tomás so uneasy became clear as they approached the central structure. The ground around the pyramid was littered with objects that clearly didn't belong to any ancient civilization. Modern camping equipment, research tools, and personal effects that looked like they had been abandoned suddenly and recently. Sarah knelt beside her, waterlogged notebook, and opened it carefully. The name on the first page made her blood run cold. Dr. Heinrich Müller, University of São Paulo, 2019. She knew that name. Müller had been a respected archaeologist who had disappeared during a research expedition 4 years ago, along with his entire team. They had never been found. As Sarah carefully examined Dr. Müller's waterlogged notebook, a chilling story began to emerge from the smeared pages. The early entries described discoveries identical to what her own team had found. The terraced gardens, the sophisticated stonework, the mysterious written language. But as she read further, Müller's scientific excitement gradually gave way to something approaching terror. Day 12. The symbols seemed to be having an effect on the team. Read one entry. Carlos has been having vivid dreams about the pyramid, claiming he can understand what the inscriptions say. Maria refuses to go near the central clearing anymore, says she hears voices calling her name in a language she doesn't recognize. The notebook's final entries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, painted a picture of a research expedition spiraling into chaos. Day 18. We should never have come here. The knowledge they left behind, it's not meant for outsiders. Every night the dreams get stronger, more vivid. I see the Arawete Carib people as they were, their ceremonies, their warnings, their desperate attempts to hide what they had learned. They disappeared for a reason. They chose to vanish rather than let this knowledge spread to the world. The last legible entry sent shivers down Sarah's spine. Day 21. The others have gone to the pyramid. They say the stones are calling to them. I'm leaving this notebook as a warning. Some secrets should stay buried. Rebecca and Carlos had been listening over Sarah's shoulder as she read aloud from Müller's journal, and the atmosphere in their small group had grown increasingly tense. This is ridiculous, Carlos said, but his voice lacked conviction. We're scientists, not characters in some horror story. There has to be a rational explanation for what happened to Müller's team. Yet, even as he spoke, Sarah noticed he kept glancing nervously toward the pyramid, and she realized that he too had been experiencing unusually vivid dreams since they'd arrived at the site. Tomás, who had been quietly gathering the scattered equipment around the pyramid's base, suddenly straightened up with a sharp intake of breath. Doutora, he called urgently. You need to see this. He was standing beside what appeared to be a natural depression in the ground, but as they approached, they realized it was actually the entrance to an underground chamber. Stone steps, carved with the same precise technique they'd seen throughout the site, descended into darkness. Fresh scratches on the stone suggested that Müller's team had discovered this entrance and explored whatever lay beneath. Against her better judgment, and despite Tomás's increasingly vocal protests, Sarah decided they had to investigate the underground chamber. Armed with powerful LED flashlights and climbing gear, the four of them descended the ancient steps into what felt like the belly of the earth itself. The air grew cooler and thinner as they went deeper, and the walls around them were covered with the most elaborate examples of the mysterious script they had yet encountered. But it was Carlos who first noticed something that made them all stop in their tracks. These aren't just inscriptions, he whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. They're moving. At first, Sarah thought the linguist was suffering from some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and the claustrophobic environment. But as she focused her flashlight beam on the walls, she could swear that the carved symbols seemed to shift and flow like living things, rearranging themselves into new patterns even as she watched. The rational part of her mind knew this had to be an optical illusion, perhaps caused by the interplay of their moving lights and the carved surfaces. But another part of her, a part that remembered every story Tomás had told around their campfire, began to understand why Padre Almeida had written about knowledge that humanity wasn't ready to possess. The underground chamber opened into a vast, natural cavern that defied everything Sarah understood about Amazonian geology. The ceiling arched high above them, supported by columns that appeared to be both natural rock formations and deliberately carved architectural elements. But what dominated the space was a massive stone table in the center, its surface covered with intricate astronomical charts that mapped celestial movements with a precision that wouldn't be matched by European astronomy for centuries after the Araweta Carib had supposedly vanished. Carlos approached the stone table with trembling hands, his flashlight beam revealing mathematical calculations carved alongside the star charts that made his mind reel. "Sarah, these formulas," he said, his voice barely audible. "They're predicting solar eclipses, planetary alignments, even what looks like calculations for the precession of the equinoxes. But according to our dating, this was carved before any civilization in the Americas should have possessed this level of astronomical knowledge." As he studied the inscriptions more closely, he began to realize something even more disturbing. These calculations extend forward in time. They're predicting celestial events that haven't happened yet, including some that won't occur for decades. Rebecca had been documenting the chamber's layout when she made a discovery that stopped her cold. Along the far wall, arranged in neat rows like some macabre library, were dozens of human skulls. But these weren't the remains of ancient burials. Some still bore traces of modern dental work, and scattered among them were personal effects that belonged unmistakably to contemporary expeditions: dog tags, waterproof watches, and camera equipment that couldn't be more than a few years old. "These are from the missing teams," she whispered to Sarah. "Not just Muller's group. There have been others, many others." The horrible truth began to dawn on them as they explored further. The Araweta Carib hadn't simply vanished from history. They had been deliberately erased, their existence hidden by successive generations who understood the danger their knowledge represented. The astronomical calculations, the mathematical formulas, the engineering techniques that had built this impossible city, all of it pointed to a level of understanding that suggested contact with something beyond human civilization. And every expedition that had discovered this place had faced the same terrible choice that Padre Almeida had written about in his journal. Tomás, who had been growing more agitated with each discovery, finally broke his silence. "My grandfather told me the whole story," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of generations of kept secrets. His grandfather was here when the last of the Araweta Carib made their choice. They had learned something from the stars, something that showed them what would happen if their knowledge spread to the outside world. Wars beyond imagination, destruction that would consume entire continents, the end of everything their people held sacred. He gestured toward the astronomical charts on the stone table. They saw the future, Doutora, and they chose to disappear rather than let that future come to pass. As if summoned by Tomás's revelation, the carved symbols on the chamber walls began to glow with a faint, phosphorescent light that had nothing to do with their flashlights. The air itself seemed to thicken around them, and Sarah felt a presence in the chamber that was ancient, watchful, and deeply concerned about what these modern intruders might do with the forbidden knowledge they had uncovered. She realized that they weren't just archaeological discoverers. They were the latest in a long line of people who had faced the same impossible choice that had driven an entire civilization to erase itself from history. The question was, would they be wise enough to make the same decision? The phosphorescent glow from the chamber walls grew brighter as Sarah and her team stood in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what they had discovered. The weight of 4 centuries of secrets pressed down on them, like the tons of earth and stone above their heads. Carlos was the first to break the silence. his voice cracking with emotion. "We have to publish this," he said desperately. "This changes everything. We know about pre-Columbian civilizations, about the development of human knowledge, about the very history of our species." But even as he spoke, his eyes remained fixed on the skulls of previous researchers, and his words carried no conviction. Rebecca shook her head slowly, her anthropologist's training warring with her growing understanding of the terrible responsibility they now carried. "Look around us, Carlos," she said softly. "Look at what happened to everyone else who thought they could share this knowledge with the world. The Arawete Carib didn't just disappear. They made a conscious choice to protect humanity from something we're not ready to understand." She gestured toward the astronomical charts that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. What if their calculations were right? What if knowledge like this in the wrong hands really could destroy everything? Thomas had been watching the interplay of personalities with the patient wisdom of someone whose family had been guardians of secrets for generations. "There is another way," he said quietly. "My people have been protecting this place for 400 years, not by hiding it completely, but by making sure that only the right people find it, and that they understand the choice they must make." He looked directly at Sarah as he continued. "The journal that came to you, it wasn't random. Someone who knew you, who had studied your work and your character, chose you because they believed you might be wise enough to become a guardian rather than an exploiter." The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. The anonymous package, the perfect timing, the fact that her specific expertise in pre-Columbian civilizations had made her uniquely qualified to understand what they had found. "None of it had been coincidence, Dr. Martinez," she whispered, remembering her elderly mentor who had passed away just months before the journal arrived. Professor Elena Martinez had spent decades studying indigenous cultures throughout South America, and she had always spoken of the importance of respecting knowledge that communities chose to keep private. She was part of this, wasn't she? Tomás nodded gravely. "She was chosen 40 years ago, just as you were chosen now. She spent her career carefully steering archaeological expeditions away from this place, while secretly documenting what she could about the Arawete Carib culture. When she knew her time was ending, she had to choose someone to continue the work of protection. Your publications, your respect for indigenous rights, your understanding that some knowledge belongs to the communities that created it. All of that convinced her that you could be trusted with the truth." As dawn light began to filter down, through cracks in the chamber ceiling, Sarah felt the weight of generations of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The astronomical charts on the stone table seemed to pulse one final time before returning to ordinary carved stone, as if the ancient knowledge itself was waiting for her decision. She looked at her team. Carlos still torn between scientific ambition and growing wisdom, Rebecca nodding slowly as she began to understand the true nature of their discovery, and Tomás watching with the patience of someone who had always known this moment would come. "We document everything," Sarah said finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the choice she was making. "But the documentation stays private, protected, passed down only to people who can be trusted to continue the work of preservation rather than exploitation. The Arawete Carib made their choice 4 centuries ago. Now we make ours." As they climbed back toward the surface, leaving the glowing chamber and its impossible secrets behind, Sarah understood that they weren't just archaeologists anymore. They had become the newest links in an ancient chain of guardians, protectors of knowledge too powerful for a world that still hadn't learned the difference between discovery and wisdom. Sarah's incredible journey reminds us that the greatest discoveries aren't always meant to be shared with the world. Sometimes, true wisdom lies in knowing when to protect rather than expose. If this story gave you chills, hit subscribe for more mysterious Amazon tales and tell us in the comments, what would you choose, fame or responsibility?